Hello and welcome everyone to today's Dignified Storytelling event at Rewired Summit. In line with the theme of Expo 2020's Knowledge and Learning Week, we are delighted to welcome you to our event, Teaching Information Literacy in the Digital Age. My name is Nadine Al-Alami. I'm the Programs Manager for Dignified Storytelling, a global movement that is working to reshape the way stories are being told by bringing together content makers and storytelling stakeholders from various sectors to foster an understanding and practice of storytelling that upholds the dignity of all persons. As part of this movement, we have developed the 10 principles of dignified storytelling together with a diverse group of stakeholders, where one of the principles focuses on truth over headlines, emphasizing the need for stories to depict realities and change prospects with accuracy and authenticity. However, we currently live in the era of the soundbite, where stories are often told in a way that neglects the context of critical events and focuses on filling the 24-hour news cycle. In this culture, there is an obsession with ratings and with tailoring the messages to the news cycle, at the expense of truth over headlines. As we consume stories within this era, we need the skills to be able to identify truth over headlines. The storytellers that will be joining today's session will debunk popular media myths while giving us a how-to guide on navigating the news landscape in the digital age. They will also highlight the role of education in fostering the skills needed to critically examine the stories that we consume. So now, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session, founder and CEO of World Class Scholars, Mr. Phil Noble.
Thank you. I could go through a long introduction of the whole panel one by one, and you'd probably forget them before they get up here. So let me just ask the panel, come up and take your seats, and we'll start from one end to the other, and we'll go from there. Wonderful. Well, since you sat here, you have to go first, right? And what I'll do is I'll introduce each of the panel members. I'll go down the line, and then we'll come back and do questions. And I'm going to tell you in advance, even the panelists, I'm going to mispronounce a lot of names and a lot of people, and I apologize up front. But it's the other side of the accent that I have. You can't pronounce everybody very well. So first is Niamh, as in Niamh, as in Kiva, as in Kiev. Did I say that? I didn't get it right. It's not even close, right? Directionally sound. She is from Microsoft. She has worked all over the Middle East with large systems empowering technical solutions and sellers all over this part of the world. Before that, she was with Vodafone and Fujitsu in the Middle East, Russia, Turkey, Eastern Europe, Africa, India, and a whole bunch of other countries that we can't even mention. Next is Michail Bletsas. He is from MIT Media Labs. He is the director of computing at MIT Media Labs. He is responsible for all of the infrastructure of that labs that produce, to store, transport, and consume its bits. We won't go into that. I love that, consume its bits. I like that too. I first met Mikaela years ago when he was one of the creators of the one laptop per child, if y'all remember that fascinating project experiment to try to radically change education around the globe. And Mikaela has the privilege of working at MIT Media Labs. I don't know if you've ever been there, but when you go in the door, within about the first 30 seconds, every time I go, my thoughts is, boy, I sure am stupid with all these smart people here. And Mikaela is one of the smartest of the crowd. Next is Derek Wyatt. Derek is my definition of a Renaissance man. He has done more different things and done them well than anybody I know. He was in Parliament for 13 years. He was the founder of the Oxford Internet Institute. He started the Computer Channel on Sky B. He was a record producer of a #1 Christmas record in UK. He was an international rugby player. He's a publisher. And if you ask him nice, he'll probably even come fix your car. He's got more skills and talent than anybody I know. And then down at the end, last but not least, and I will mispronounce all of her titles, Mikaela Jade. She is I'm not even going to say it. We used to pronounce a Carborgal woman of the Durango-speaking nation of Sydney. I wasn't even close, was I?
No, you're right. Cabrigal from the Darug-speaking nation. Yeah.
And she has a fascinating company and career that's creating opportunities for over 400 million first people in using and designing frontier technologies by teaching cutting-edge digital skills through a cultural lens. Her Indigital school has worked with 7,000 students across Australia to improve their understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island culture through teaching spatial web technologies, including augmented and mixed reality. I have no clue what that is, but you're going to tell us, right?
Yeah, I certainly am, thank you.
One of the things that you talked about was this whole notion of blind spots, of the way we as a digital culture tend to lose a broader perspective and get focused into content bias is one way of saying it. But it's a focusing on our bubble, if you will. Do you want to tell us why that is so important to you? Why do you think that's a driver?
So thanks, Phil. I think, and so I'll just go back 1 second. So it's Niamh as in Kiev.
I told you I'd get it wrong.
So I think blind spots are, obviously we all have them. We all also have bias in what we do. When it comes to technology, I think there's a number, and if the context of the conversation today around how we think about transmedia, multiple media sources, and how do we help our younger generation who are digital natives to dissect that information, understand what's relevant, and as our introduction said, get beyond the sound bite. So if we zoom out from that for a moment, because we're talking about digital natives, these are people who are super familiar with all of the technology and are taking all of those sources of information in. As a younger generation, where they may have less experience is in how to curate that information, how to decide what is most relevant to them, decide what is something that they believe in and understand why they believe it, right, through the sources that they're getting. On the flip side, if you think about the teachers, the educators, they have those critical analytical skills and they can teach them, but they're not digital native, they're digital immigrant. And therefore, there's a barrier between these two communities in the classroom. You have the digital natives who need to build a skill of critical thinking, and you have the digital immigrant who has the critical skill and capability and can disseminate it, but they're not familiar with the technologies so much, and they're not digital natives. So I think for me, it's about how do we create a different environment in the classroom where we think differently. It's not a hierarchy of somebody knows something and they're going to teach the other person. It's more about how can we leverage all of the knowledge and all of the capabilities. When I think about blind spots, that's a bit, for me, where some of those blind spots are. We're assuming in our education system that there's one group of people who are teaching another group of people, and I just don't think that that's how it does or should work, and I think that alienates the younger generation because they feel empowered and strong in the things that they're really good at, and they should be encouraged to do that.
Do you think that's creating more conflict within education, within the classroom?
So I guess there's every scenario
Right.
because there's a journey, and I think there are probably educators who are very aware and already working. There are technologies that are helping to break down those barriers. Mikaela will talk a little bit probably about how they're using and how, in fact, we just found out today that our two organizations are collaborating. So if you take, for instance, and one of those in our case is Minecraft, where you take a technology, it's gamification, but it allows, Minecraft education allows, in a classroom environment, to really allow the children to take on a topic, think about different media and information sources, and find a way of dissecting the information and the content that's being pushed at them and decide what's relevant, what's not. So I think there's, and then of course I'm sure there are very traditional classrooms where the hierarchy is very strong and a rethinking is not where that set of people maybe are at. And of course there are, and again, an area where Mikaela is working strongly and where Michail with the OLPC project we're working was to make sure that that fundamental baseline technology is available to everybody in the first place.
Mikaela, I'm going to ask you one of those really short questions that one could write volumes and volumes on, but you're the man for the job here. How do you use technology to create different education outcomes? That presupposes we don't like what we got, but how does the technology enable that to happen?
Technology gives you access to a much wider world than your current physical context allows. That's generally a desirable thing. I mean, you do that with world-class scholars. But there is the issue of blind spots. So we know what these blind spots were. We didn't think that we will end up in an environment, in a post-truth environment. Unfortunately, being a digital native means that you don't have been exposed to truth as much these days. And that's where education needs to go in and emphasize skills that school doesn't give you traditionally. And those skills are skills that, for example, journalists are supposed to have. So critical thinking and fact-checking. And, you know, if you know how to use those tools, the paradox that we live today, where there is all this misinformation, disinformation, fake news, etc., at the same time where most of these things could be dealt with by a simple internet search. In a lot of cases, you don't really need to do extensive fact-checking if you know what you're doing. So technology has to solve this problem and can solve this problem that sort of help create itself. I mean, people create the problems with tools, but it's the answer also. It provides part of the answer. So we need to start incorporating technology into teaching, fact-checking, research skills, and critical thinking into schools. And how we do that? We do it with a series of exercises, and we do it with a series of learning by doing practices on school. But we have to start early. Finland provides a very good example on how to do that, because they have been doing it probably longer than anybody else in a formal way, in a formalized way in their schools.
Yeah. We talked earlier before the session, and we were talking, Mikaela and I were talking about the need for what I call really radically different education. And he floated a line, I don't know if it was just off the top of your head. He said, we have to be very sneaky how we bring about radical reform, because parents don't want us to use their children for guinea pigs, and politicians don't want to take any kind of risk. Is that the fundamental barrier that we have to overcome? It's the parents' reluctance and the politicians' reluctance. Is that the problem?
It is a problem. It is definitely a problem. I don't know if it is the only problem. I don't think it is the only problem. But it's certainly, I think, the top one. Nobody likes to experiment. Parents don't like to be experiments on their kids. And there are teachers don't like, nobody likes to change. Everybody likes to change if it doesn't affect them. We all like change, but as long as it is for somebody else. And that's normal. I mean, we get comfortable in our environment. So, yeah, we have to let the kids be a little bit more in charge, I think. We have to get peer-to-peer learning into the mix a lot more, and we have to get the teachers to become more like coaches, learning coaches, and less of, the source of truth and authority. The kids have to learn how to discover truth. They shouldn't rely on teacher as the source of truth. I think that's a fundamental shift in mentality that we have to do. And you have to be very careful on how you communicate that. That has been, in my sort of involvement with, peripheral involvement with politics, is the safest way to kill something when it has to do with change is to start putting it on top of your PR, if you want. You have to have a very good plan of what you want to do, and you have to give people to understand why this is important. And the best way to do that is if you do it, if you involve everybody in the process so that people can see the benefits of your method. You have to show results early on, and results are more important than actually, long-term vision and try to sell that vision prematurely. It has to be an incremental approach with everybody involved. And it's easy to see that with kids.
Yeah.
I was extremely surprised. My kids just went to university, but I was extremely surprised to see how much different their education was from what I received. They started doing presentations when they were in 4th grade or 3rd grade. I didn't get to do a presentation using technology. I didn't get to do a presentation until I presented my diploma thesis at the university. So, change is happening. And it's better to show the results of that than actually, push for it directly.
That's interesting. I'm going to, Derek, as I introduced him as a Renaissance man, has done lots of interesting things. One of the more interesting was he decided to go back to, what was it, King's College London at some advanced age to get a master's degree in international relations. How long ago was that, Derek?
3 years ago.
3 years ago. Lifelong learning. And one of the things I found that was fascinating was what his master's thesis was on how ISIS used technology and social media and indoctrinating and engaging young people. And I've thought about, you know, in one sense, they were incredibly effective in the sense of just the efficacy of making that happen. And so my question is sort of, what did you learn about ISIS and their use of the technology to, quote, educate young people? And how does that can be applied constructively within an education system, particularly around the poor kids and socially disadvantaged folks that I know you care a great deal about?
In 10 minutes?
In 10 minutes, or less.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for coming to our session. Well, one of the points about ISIS is really that they were ahead of the CIA and the MI6. I put it in that way. They were smarter. They spoke Arabic. They knew how the systems worked. They made stuff in 20-second bursts, in 90-second bursts, in 2.5-minute bursts. They made them in cartoons, in films, in color. They promised a world that was different, better, and a place in heaven. That's quite a lot. So on the one hand, I don't want to make this an ISIS talk, but we were so far behind. So in the sense, the way in which Mikaela talks, is that our teaching is analog and we are digital. Our children are more digital than we are. We're slow digital, I'd say. And that is the problem, is that the organization that presents education is largely analog. So here you have an example for a way of trying to change that system. Let me just say a few things about that. So dignified is a hard word. It's a challenging word. It's hard to spell. It's even harder to write on a URL. So you've got to think about whether you shorten that to D and classify that, or DIG or DIGI or something. But if you're going to take this worldwide, which I think you are, you've got to think about the branding of that. That is really critical. And you've got to think about children under 11 might struggle with that word, just in what it means and how you write it. So before you get too far, do that. I always try to think, if I was here on a panel in a year's time, what would be the steps that I would try and help build? And one of the things, of course, is storytelling is books. It's books. Children's books are sold in more quantity than ever before. It's extraordinary. So you could have maybe 5 pages of that book online and chapters over here. So you interchange how you introduce. A book is beautiful. Feel. Think of all the children's books you've read. So I would not necessarily think that this has to be just digital in the way that it's websites and WhatsApp and whatever, TikTok as we would say. So I think it's meshing and trying to bring those two things together. The other thing is, if you are interested in making this global, and I see you've got 5 languages so far, well, why not make 5? Why not use a hub and spoke model? Why make this the hub, but make the spoke Spanish, say, in San Diego, or Hindi in Chennai, or wherever? But why not make this a global thing first, and then see how you can go? So I'll stop there.
Within that context, are there tools that ISIS was using with young people for some reason that was more appropriate or more effective than, say, the schools of Sheffingham, England? I mean, what was it that made them so effective as a communicator and a motivator to young people? Was it the content or was it the
Yes,
technology?
no, there wasn't a centre. It wasn't. I think that how many? At one stage, I thought there were 600,000 people online at one stage creating content for ISIS. You know, that is an astonishing build. But they didn't sort of own you. It happened. It happened right across the world simultaneously. It wasn't, you know, sent down from the top. Of course, the messaging was really clever, and they had a media center, and that was the brilliance of it. So did Al-Qaeda, by the way. So these aren't new things, but they were much more sophisticated. They used closed networks when they wanted to talk to one another, you know, confidentially. They're very hard to break, Telegram especially. But they didn't just use Telegram. They used lots of different ones. They were, as I said, they were far ahead of us. And the other thing was, in the West, we tended to think that actually, you know, places like Dubai and Saudi and Kuwait didn't have iPhones. But actually, per capita, you have higher sales, which may surprise you, but it surprised me initially when I started this. So these were savvy. These kids were savvy, much savvier than us, much savvier than our armed service officers and our intelligence people. And I don't think we've clocked that even now.
Fascinating. Mikaela, you deal with indigenous communities of Australia which have a rich oral storytelling culture. Talk a little bit about the role of the storytelling within that culture and how you've tried to marry that with digital skills.
Yeah, thank you. Warami, Bujari Gumara, Yanama, Mikaela.
Mikaela.
Yes, I'm a Capricorn woman, and I've just said to you, I see you, thank you for coming, and I walk on this country with good spirit. And I'd like to just acknowledge there are several Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this room today who extend from the oldest living culture on earth. We have 80,000 years of knowledge tangled up in our culture and in our country, and it's a very big privilege to sit here as a First Nations woman and talk to you about something as deep as our cultural knowledge systems. To me, dignified storytelling is all about making way and protecting the dignity of my people and other 400 million other First Nations people and ethnic minorities around the world, and particularly when other people are sharing our stories. We at Indigital, my company, we have embraced frontier technologies, augmented and mixed reality, to share our story through the right language at the right time, at the right place for the right reasons, told by the right person. And we're stepping into the future space to be able to share this knowledge with non-Indigenous peoples as well through a very exciting technological medium. We work in the internet that you're in and not the internet that you're looking at on a screen. And this is interesting to people because there is a dialogue internationally about the capability of First Peoples in frontier technologies, which is completely biased and wrong. We are at the forefront of technology. We have walked in the metaverse for 80,000 years and hold deep knowledge about the responsibility of working both in the physical world and multiple verses of reality as well. So I think we have a really fantastic opportunity for our people to contribute to something like the metaverse. In doing that, people that work with us, so Microsoft is a fantastic partner of ours. They've partnered with my company for 4 years, likewise with Telstra. Corporations who work with us want to share our story too. And dignified storytelling is all about how do our partners share their excitement about working with us and our people all around Australia and internationally in a dignified way. And I've been very privileged to work with both Microsoft and Telstra to do this in a way that honours our cultural protocols. So all of our peoples have protocols around keeping knowledge and keeping language and keeping our law. And Microsoft and Telstra have worked with us to, when they're doing communication around the work that we're doing in augmented and mixed reality, working with us on that storytelling so it is dignified, so it is truth over headlines, because we know us working in mixed reality technologies as First Peoples is really exciting, and lots of people want to know about it. But all the communication that comes out about our programs needs to be told through the lens of our First Peoples and our communities, with permission from our elders and adhering to our cultural protocols. So the way that we do that is make sure that they're walking our cultural protocols with us in that communication and headline. It came down, there was a big advertising campaign in Australia last year around our company and our partnership with Telstra, and they wanted to use stock photography and stock footages of our people using technology. Now, when you search the internet for Aboriginal and iPad, the stuff that comes up on the internet in stock photography and footage is horrendous. It's cave people with battens and like really caricatured people. It's very offensive. They didn't want to use that, by the way, but that's what the search engine came up with. So we worked to say, no, you must start from scratch. You must go and work with our people and have permission. Pay our people. Make sure that we had an elders council around every step of the campaign in sharing our story, and making sure that it was going to be a campaign that not just Microsoft and Telstra could be proud of, but us as First Peoples and our communities could be proud of as well.
That's fascinating. Talk about how what you've just outlined plays into or is consistent or at conflict with the whole notion of informational literacy as the rest of us in non-Indigenous cultures think about that term.
Yeah, information literacy for us, I think, and this is just my perspective as a Doric woman, is being able to both discern what is culturally true for our people, but also understand why other people might have perspectives of us, and also getting into the digital media side of it. It's really difficult for our young people to see themselves in technologies. There's not a lot of imagery, or there's not a lot of curriculum around First Peoples in technology. We've in fact had to build it ourselves in order for our young people to see themselves in frontier technologies. We're really excited to work with Xbox this year and wrap an Xbox and Xbox controllers for the very first time in Indigenous artwork, so our mob could see ourselves in a piece of hardware. Like, we've never been able to see ourselves in a piece of hardware before. So being able to communicate visually, communicate orally, and provide opportunities for our young people to learn digital skills through a cultural lens is incredibly important. So our young people can see themselves not just being consumers of information in the metaverse or even in Web 2.0, but being creators and curators and contributors to developing new engineering systems and new content.
Interesting. I want to go down, and we've got essentially, if you believe the clock, that's going to go nuts on us here in a minute. If we can do a couple of minutes for each of you on a subject that, according to my notes, that you really care about. And you talked about going to kids where they are, as opposed to trying to take them where we think they ought to be. Talk about that as a impediment or spur to the kind of education that we're all trying to get to.
So I think a couple of people have talked about, and you mentioned the information literacy, and I was listening and I was thinking, gosh, it's not that we have a new problem, we just have a different perspective on the same problem. If I think about my own upbringing, I'm sure you've all heard in my accent so far that I'm Irish, and Ireland in the 70s was a very homogenous place. Everybody looked the same, everybody came from more or less the same religious background. So our information literacy was a different problem of everybody looking and sounding exactly the same and holding more or less similar views. If I think about most children now who have access through technology, their information literacy is less that they're excluded from having access to information and different sources, and more that they have too many sources. And it's about how do they see the wood for the trees? How do they start to break down that information, those sources, and develop the critical thinking that Michail was talking about. So I think for me, it's maybe helpful for us to think about this as a challenge that has just changed, as opposed to a challenge that is completely, you know, that everything was perfect before and now we've got this new problem that we have to try and solve together. And then when we think about the dignified storytelling, I think for me this overarching theme of inclusion is so important. I think Mikaela has already spoken really eloquently about that and some really practical implementation, you know, what that can mean for different groups of people. But I think there's also some dignity to the people we're talking about in this room, which is a younger generation, and making them part. I think they will really help us. They're not without capability and knowledge and know-how. Somebody mentioned in the line here the role of the coach, and I think if we think of ourselves as learners, there's something to be gained from our children, their knowledge, their capability. They know stuff we don't know. We need to listen to them. And if we feel we have something to impart, I think we have to do it much more in a coaching frame than in a telling frame. And that might democratize a little bit what our education system looks like.
Yeah. Mikaela says, I find this very interesting that you and I earlier were talking and you were expressing your concern about the demise of long-form reading. And I think that for a tech guy, that's an interesting thing to be concerned about. Elaborate.
No, because exactly I'm a tech guy, and we live in the current marketing term is we live in the era of artificial intelligence. One of the things that you realize very quickly is that computers are very far away from being able to tell a good story. This is one of the fundamental human skills that computers will never be able to do in the near future, at least. So, in our lifetime, I think. So, nevertheless, we live in an era where we have essentially given the responsibility of storytelling to computers, to very rudimentary algorithms whose main objective is to keep us engaged. So we throw short snippets of information that essentially produce a lot of dopamine and nothing else in our brains. And we are producing people who are getting hooked to that kind of operation, of getting information in short snippets, repeated snippets that produce dopamine and nothing else. And that was my blind spot. I worked on algorithms that would give you the information that you wanted, and essentially ended up on algorithms that give you information that will keep you hooked up right now. And I would have seen a light at the end of the tunnel in the sense that kids don't use Facebook, but I think they don't use Facebook because they like to get shorter and shorter snippets. So the countries that are doing very well in media literacy, in the Media Literacy Index, are the countries who are doing also very well at the PISA reading scores. So, giving good stories to kids, or stories that keep them engaged, is still a very important thing. And, emphasizing that. And, stories can be delivered in a variety of ways. And what I'm getting a little bit concerned is that, the medium is becoming the message.
It's always been
more and more. And we're talking about the metaverse right now, but you know what? It's very difficult to make compelling content in that environment. But we have to do it, because otherwise you cannot keep the kids engaged. And hopefully we will be doing longer form reading. That will become an important objective going on and become more formal. Right now we don't really pay much attention to that.
Derek was very much involved. Were you one of the founders of Open University, or just
No,
President
I
Clay?
no, third year student, so I
Yeah.
did.
Open University, can you just give 10 seconds on what Open University is and what you think the ramifications are for the wild success, relatively wild success of Open University for digital learning for kids?
I'm not sure they're connected, actually. But Open University, well, if you take Ethiopia, they had a civil war with Eritrea for 20-odd years. When finally the fighting stopped and Addis, the senior army commanders suddenly were Secretary of State for Education, Secretary of State for buildings, said they had no experience whatsoever as to how to jump from fighting to managing. And the president at the time insisted they did MBAs at the Open University. 23 of the 25 cabinet members got an MBA in 3 years. That's why Ethiopia, for a while, I'm sad it's kind of gone back slightly in the last year, but it was at the bottom of the pile. It was always the worst country in the world, but geez, it went flying. It will fly again. It's an amazing idea. So I got up at 6 every morning. I turned on the television. There was empty wavelengths. I listened to people talking to me either in radio or on television or on video packs or on books or on whatever for 6 years because I didn't go to university. So, it changed my life. So I'm a big fan of the Open University. There ought to be an Open University online. It ought to be an infant school and start upwards, but for some reason it isn't. There's either a lack of imagination there or it's a lack of imagination at the government side. I would say, though, Phil, there's some things we could do. If we're going to a 4-day week, do we go to a 4-day school? No one's asked me that. No one's thought about, well, what happens then? Well, what about the formal schooling going Monday to Thursday and the informal schooling starting on Friday? Very soon the informal will be going Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Monday. That's hardly radical, but there's no risk in that. We talked about risk in politicians, somebody. What about if at 18 you've got a 7-year voucher to do whatever you liked in education? It didn't have to be a degree. It could be actually motor vehicle learning or hairdressing. It didn't matter, but you got it by right as they get it in Sweden. What about if at 60 you got another 5 years? You could retrain and be something else. Because we're not going to retire people, are we? We're going to semi-retire them. Well, how do we upgrade those skill sets? We all need to do it. The nations need to do it. So there is a less risk, I think, approach to come, but there's just no vision or leadership currently in most of the Western world. So we look here because there's imagination and, to be honest, a bit of money.
Mikaela, you've been a strong advocate that we as a society and culture have got to be on the front foot, if you will, of developing Web 3.0. What most concerns you about that?
What concerns me is I don't see a lot of First Peoples being involved in that conversation, and I don't see a lot of people making way for even females and women in that conversation. I think if we could definitely make space for other narratives, other ethnicities, other backgrounds, other genders in the metaverse, because we're going to end up with a space that's unsafe and that perpetuates the divide between those who have and those who have not if we do not do that.
Fascinating. Well, this is a really interesting panel to me for a whole bunch of reasons because, I mean, if you look across here, we're from 5 different countries, we're 5 different started to say age groups, but we have a pretty decent range, and all of the different sort of professional experiences. One of the things someone once told me, they said, if you really want to understand all these sort of complex issues, you've got to find a professional storyteller. And so we have a professional storyteller who is going to come and just elucidate everything we have said and make it all clear and make it into a 16mm film that will be ready by dinner. I want to introduce Valentino Castanini Quinn, who is an award-winning film producer. She is president of Quinn Entertainment. And as a storyteller, it is her job to synthesize our human experience in a way that can be played back to us, that has relevance, has meaning, has power, and has passion. So, with that, come elucidate us.
Hello, welcome everybody. Where am I sitting in here?
You sit right here,
Oh,
or you can
fantastic.
stand.
Good evening. Anthony Quinn, which is my legacy, where I come from, was a gardener before to become a celebrity. He crossed the Cahuenga Pass from Mexico to America by walking as a kid with his family. And throughout his career as an actor, he always chose to remember his humble connections and origins, and chose to play many ethnical roles, almost symbolizing embracing all humanities. When it came my time to continue the legacy of him and his son, Francesco, who was my husband, I chose to walk the same path and produce films, documentary, focusing real issues in life. A film nowadays, in fact, is the most impactful platform to convey an idea, to bring up change in society. Let's think about the film An Inconvenient Truth, film made by Vice President Al Gore, that was made with $1 million and produced at the box office $50 million. Platforms such as Netflix, Hulu, Amazon are expanding their documentary section. Let's talk about digital content media. Now it seems to be something that actually our kids are teaching us, in fact. And it's now becoming the #1 source of information and education. So apps, video games, social media, we can upload a 60-second clip and impact millions of people. There is an app, Joblio. It's a fresh new app that is revolutionizing global immigration, setting new ethical standards and human rights, and eliminating human trafficking. This is huge, through a free app working very well with governments nowadays. The industry, the film industry, is changing and is becoming more and more interconnected with civil rights, politics, economy, finances. Why? Because a film is conveying a message through visuals and emotions. See, as people, we connect and believe more in people than organizations, structures, politics. It is at the human level that we connect the most. When we started filming our award-winning documentary, One Rock Through Religions, we were just 4 filmmakers believing in an idea to create a peaceful dialogue between Israel and Palestine. Of course, very difficult, sensitive topic to tackle, and we had a very little budget and no celebrities in the film. At the time, I read in the news that Pope Francis was in Jerusalem and invited President Shimon Peres and President Mahmoud Abbas to pray together at the Vatican. I thought, that's it. That's how the movie should start. But who could grant me the permit to film such an unprecedented historical event. Security was so high in Italy at that time that no plane was allowed to fly over the country through the time these two presidents were in Rome. So of course I had to rely to my inner connection, my human resources, and I Googled the Pope. Yes, I always tell to journalists, I Googled the Vatican and found out that there were 30 minutes every day that the Vatican would take phone calls. And so I followed the rules. I called at the time suggested, which was my 3 a.m. Los Angeles time, and I started to speak with the nun. And it came very clear to me that any title, name, connections, actor I could bring up was completely irrelevant. Eventually, she passed me to the director of the press office, Father Lombardi, with which I started what I call my 10-night confessions. In fact, this father would ask me all kinds of questions that were never pertinent to the film, but actually to my education, my persona, my emotions, my choices, my family. And every night, we would go on for 30 minutes, and at the end of the 30 minutes, the father would tell me, okay, let's talk some more tomorrow, call me back. And this went on for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, I said, well, Father Lombardi, listen, we are 3 days away from the historical event. What have you been deciding? And he tells me, fine, you're going to be the only one filming at the Vatican. Why am I telling you this story? Because social impact starts from human connections. It starts from the single level to then spread universally. So, of course, we understood that if the Pope was believing in us, we weren't just 4 filmmakers believing in something. We were a tribe around the world wanting to make it happen. The film won 18 international awards, including the Human Rights Award and the U.S. Congress Award recognitions. And throughout the screening at U.S. Congress, 2 new bills of rights were created in the protections of the minorities in the Middle East. That's the power of a film nowadays. So, film, digital content, social impact, change. When before a film was just narrating an event that already happened, now a film can bring up change, or digital content can bring up change, a new idea, and propel it and influence a government, a society, a country. And talking about a country, I would like to thank the Emirate for hosting me this month, because in fact I just signed a partnership, the first historical partnership between a studio in Hollywood and the royal family in the Emirates to produce film together and create a bridge between Hollywood and storytelling and this wonderful country. And our first film is actually an educational film, a true story called Polo, that narrates the true story of a group of kids, unprivileged kids from the suburbia of an American city that finds redemption and inspiration through the sport of polo, which is considered for history, by history, the sport of kings, but in our story is actually our courage and attitude towards life that makes us kings. So, now, I would like to share with you a little bit of my life, because many times when we are on stage as an audience, we wonder, who is she? Why she's on stage? Why she's allowed to talk to us? So 10 years ago, my husband, the son of Anthony Quinn, Francesco, suddenly died of a heart attack while playing with our kids. In about 3 minutes, my life, as I knew it, was in pieces. It felt like falling. In the months after he died, his reading glasses were still sitting on the bedside table. And every night, before I would go to sleep, I would take these glasses and hold them tight, like a handle that would prevent me from falling. Night after night, I would take these glasses and hold them tight. Until one night, I took these glasses And I opened my hand and I put them down. I decided to fall and not be afraid anymore. It is from this simple, symbolic gesture that all abundance came into my life. A month later, I created Quinn Studios Entertainment, and in a year, I had our first film, The Butterfly's Dream, is on Netflix, a candidate for an Academy Award and a Golden Globe. We did a film about peace in the Middle East. We spoke at United Nations, at US Congress, all about and because that simple gesture of putting the glasses down. Now, you see, not everybody can relate to an Oscar, an Academy Award, but we can all relate to such simple gesture that can shift our thoughts and bend our destiny. You see, I define a leader as someone who owns the full trajectory of his life. Someone who can embrace falling and transform it into flying. I'm committed to do that. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Valentina, to Phil, our moderator, and to all the panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who is attending here in person and virtually. I would like to invite you all now to join us for the Rewired Summit closing in the main plenary hall. Thank you.
Thank you.
No questions.
No questions.